now. All right. Good morning, afternoon, and good evening, Care Youth T. Thank you so much for joining us for this next installment of our Global Issues Unfolded series. Today's interview, in light of yesterday being International Day of Education, will be centered around the subject of education, specifically how teaching and learning have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and how this has resulted in disparities relating to accessibility and the overall experience of education. UNESCO announced that the theme of this year's International Day of Education is Changing Course, Transforming Education. We hope that this conversation contributes to the ever-growing discourse and literature on the criticality of education and the ways in which we can make it accessible and adaptable for all.
Though we're all tuning in from different areas of the world, it is important to recognize the land upon which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across the Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context, and colonialism is a current ongoing process that we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation, as stated by Northwestern University. Care U of T stands as an ally of Indigenous people around the world today and always.
Thank you for that land acknowledgement, Sada. As this Global Issues Unfolded is focused on the subject of education, we are proud to welcome Dr. Julia Forgie today. Dr. Julia Forgie is assistant professor, teaching stream, and coordinator of the Education Society program. She completed a Bachelor of Arts honors in sociology and criminology from the University of Toronto and a master's in child study and education from OISE at the University of Toronto. She also completed her PhD in developmental psychology and education at OISE, where her dissertation looked at early childhood educators' knowledge and teaching efficacy for early literacy instruction. Her research interests include teacher, early childhood educator education, preparation and teaching efficacy, language and literacy development, multiple literacies, and play in education. Her current research examines K-12 teachers' efficacy for teaching online during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It is my pleasure. Thank you very much for that warm introduction.
No problem.
So we'll start with the interview, and our first question is, we'd like to ask, what does education mean to you? So like, what does education involve or result in terms of emotion or states for an individual or community?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously quite a question to unpack. Education and teaching and learning is certainly multifaceted, and there are many, different perspectives to take when generating a definition. But when I think about education as a whole, I think about progress, really. I think about education as a vehicle for progress, as an opportunity to affect social change, through, the interactions of students and teachers, and ultimately shaping and guiding, learners to achieve their highest potential in various domains and dimensions. So I think that, education in terms of a formal sense is a structured learning environment, typically happening in a school environment with prescribed curriculum that is ultimately helping to guide and shape the youth and adults in a university context, of course, to ascertain their greatest potential to obviously become socialized within the norms and sort of norms and sort of general consensus of what's important to know in a given, context and place. So, you've got those basic, more foundational skills and aspects of knowledge being developed. But I think ultimately, in a more sort of philosophical sense, the idea is that we're preparing, future generations for responsible citizenship. So, I think you were asking about, emotional states or feelings tied to education. I think that, education and learning is very emotional, and as an educator, I think you need to be aware of how emotionally driven learning and teaching can be, and approach teaching and education from a pedagogy of care and empathy, and help support, again, learners in whatever context you're in to really achieve that ultimate goal of reaching their highest potential. So long answer to your short question, I do kind of I equate education and growth with sort of progress um, and thinking about the role of education in promoting social change for the better. Of course, it doesn't always happen that way, but I think that that's ultimately the underlying goal of education.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Forgie. I really appreciate how like socially oriented and growth oriented your perspective on like education and pedagogy is. Like, I feel like a lot of times, and sometimes like at very like academic institutions, very much like it's the acquisition of knowledge, how you can apply that in knowledge immediately or like the most intelligent sounding way. And like that's not necessarily, like you said, that's not necessarily always the point. Like it's supposed to be like, you know, education is supposed to like bring you happiness and allow you to like contribute to the well-being and happiness of others.
Exactly. And I actually think it's those global competencies that are developed in a formal schooling setting, like problem solving, collaborative learning, critical thinking. Those are the skills that are really most critical for navigating, the professional realm. How often are you in a situation in your work life where you have to recall facts from the top of your head without being able to consult a colleague or, check on the internet or access a book as a resource, right? So I think it's about teaching. Of course, you want to become a master and expert in a given field. So, that content knowledge is important, but it's also about really, building proficient learners who are capable of, encountering challenges, addressing challenges, overcoming challenges, and in diverse ways in multiple contexts.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of learning and I guess teaching itself, as a professor yourself, would you be able to speak to the difficulties and obstacles you faced and continue to face as universities delivered online? Additionally, as your current research focuses on K-12 teachers' efficacy for teaching online, would you be able to share some of your research findings? So degrees of efficacy for online teaching, rates of homework completion, like all that sort of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll first talk about my own experiences. So I've actually been at the University of Toronto, Victoria College. This is my third year. So like many students in the university, I have never had a full typical year. So in my first year of teaching, that was like 2020. So obviously we know in March is when the pandemic first emerged. I had some limited experience teaching online through my work at OISE at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, but it was quite limited. So, we were all sort of thrown into this situation. Most of us had limited online teaching experience, and now we were, having to adapt our program for the last sort of few weeks of the semester. So I did my best for those final weeks and tried to be as accommodating as possible with students. I actually ended up recording lectures and posting them online. I didn't do synchronous classes, but over the coming spring, I really thought I'm going to sit down and I'm going to learn the technologies. I'm going to make sure that I'm able to provide the best possible instruction. Should we continue online in some way? And there was, some great training opportunities available through the university. And I just, I really took on as much as I could in terms of professional development and learning. So I felt better prepared for the fall of 2020. And I actually started off in dual delivery. So I'm not sure if you had that experience at the University of Toronto at all, but we were trying to deliver online synchronous instruction to those students who were online, many of whom were out of the city, simultaneously teaching in person to a limited number of students. So it was challenging for sure. My biggest challenge was not the technology. I was confident with the technology, but rather figuring out how to integrate my online students and my in-person students in a meaningful way. So my classes are very discussion-based. I do a lot of applied hands-on activities. And I was able to do that well with the online group through breakout rooms. And I was able to do that well with the in-person group through in-person discussions, but really in a meaningful way, integrating the two groups was really challenging. So ultimately, because of the conditions with the pandemic in the late fall of last year, we ended up moving entirely online anyway. And in some ways that was easier because, you can build, a community where everybody is integrated in one context. So, I've had I've been able to be quite successful in my online teaching, I think, in terms of from my perspective, because I've been able to adapt many of the activities and lessons I do for an online context. I always have a very kind of detailed, organized Quarkus shell where I would be posting, many digital resources anyway. So that wasn't so much of a transition. From the student's perspective, I think that in some ways it's easier for adults to learn online than children, because you're autonomous and independent, but students were really missing the opportunity to connect with each other. It's those sort of incidental moments of, connecting with your peers and your teachers before class and during break that really aren't replicated. It can't be replicated in an online context, just the opportunity to kind of chat informally. So I was really excited to teach again in person this fall. And I did actually continue with a dual delivery opportunity just to give students as much flexibility as possible. So in the fall, I was teaching both of my courses in person, but I would pull up Zoom while I was, there lecturing to students and there was usually like a couple of students online who couldn't be there because they weren't feeling well or couldn't make it to campus. So that is my plan. When we do go back in person, I will try to continue doing that because I want students to be able to access the course content as best as they can. So, practically that's the way I run my courses. I also record my lectures or my classes. I call them lectures, but they're not really lectures. They're more seminars. I record them and I post them online, through my media. So it's password protected, only viewable, not downloadable by the students. So that if a student's not able to attend class, they can still participate sort of retrospectively and be part of that. And then they submit like an accountability piece. So, I'm trying to do as much as I can to accommodate students. And that's really my main focus is how can I provide my students with the most enriching learning experience? Keeping in mind that we're in so many different places, like not only geographically, but in terms of our level of comfort with the pandemic and our feelings of being engaged and included in person or online. So I really try to do it all as best as I can. It's a lot easier to do when I have a TA, I should say, because a TA can kind of help me monitor the chat while I'm teaching in person. But that's not always the case, obviously, because of, guidelines surrounding enrollments and whatnot. But certainly my department has been very supportive of providing support where possible. So, does it work for every student? No. I think some students really appreciate the flexibility. I think, and I do survey students. So every course I teach at the beginning of the course, I survey students. I ask them to complete a first day of class questionnaire. It's just a simple Google form. And I ask them about, their preferences on course modality and anything they might want to tell me about their learning needs or any concerns they might have. So I feel like I'm trying to gather as much information about students as possible. I ask them about, their work and volunteer commitments because I want to know, how much time they'll be able to give to the course. And then I check in periodically. I sort of do these little surveys periodically. And the results have shown me that most students kind of prefer a combination. Like they really want the in-person experience, but they like the flexibility of maybe having 1 or 2 classes online or having assessments online. So I would say moving forward, as much as I can within the scope of the guidelines of the university and teaching, I would like to offer a more of a hybrid option to students. So, in-person classes for sure, but the opportunity to maybe do a little bit online. Maybe it's focused around assessment or something of that nature, or little activities during the in-person session that are online. But I think a hybrid approach is actually what many students want. So that's what I would say about teaching in the university context. And then you also asked about my research. Please, jump in if you want me to circle back on anything or if I'm missing anything. So my research most recently has looked at teaching efficacy for online teaching during COVID-19. And we're looking at K-12 teachers. And when I say we, I'm referring to myself and my colleague, Dr. Lisa Dack at OISE. So how this project came to be is spring of 2020, when the pandemic first emerged. And we had our 2-week lockdown. Remember that? The 2-week lockdown. So Lisa and I are both parents of young children, and we're both academics and professors. And again, we had very understanding chairs and directors who knew we had children at home who at the time really weren't getting much instruction, as schools were sort of figuring out how to transition to an online context. And yet we were still teaching our classes. So we're sort of like, how are we supposed to do this? How do we navigate this? So we thought, okay, we've got to figure out how to teach our classes, how to support our children, and get through the days. But also we need to study this. Like, this is the time to study what is happening with teachers in schools. So we put together, a very kind of quick ethics proposal. We thought we need to collect our data as soon as we can. So we were successful in collecting our first round of data in really, May of 2020. And we essentially wanted to look at how are teachers navigating the world of online instruction, but particularly we were interested in looking at efficacy, teaching efficacy. So if you're unfamiliar, teaching efficacy refers to teachers' own sense of their competency, essentially their belief in their ability to achieve a task. It's a forward, a future-oriented trait. So you're not thinking about your past performance, you're thinking about your ability to do something in the future. So we hypothesized that teachers would feel less efficacious about teaching online than they would in person, unless they had tons of online teaching experience and that was sort of their main modality of teaching. And we wanted to assess teachers in public schools and in private schools, K to 12, so the span of primary, elementary years, all the way into secondary years. And we wanted to, we knew we didn't have time to approach school boards and go through the ethics process there. We had obviously ethics approval at the University of Toronto. So we thought we have to figure out how to recruit teachers in such a way that we can do this quickly. So I'm actually a teacher by trade. Before I finished my PhD, I was teaching in the classroom. And I'm a member of various Facebook groups that focus on teaching. And some have, 20,000 members, 20,000 teachers in a single Facebook group. So we decided to recruit most of our participants through Facebook. So I would simply, reach out to the group admins and say, I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher. Can I post a link to a survey? And see if anybody's interested. And we had over 300 participants in 2 days. It was remarkable. Teachers wanted to be heard. They wanted to share their insights on really, at the time, what was very challenging for teachers. So we did a couple of rounds of data collection. The first time point was in that May period of time, and we assessed using a quantitative measure. It's an efficacy measure that's been used many times before, but in an in-person context. So we wanted to have teachers complete that, thinking about their online teaching context. And it's essentially looking at teacher efficacy from 3 dimensions: student engagement, instructional strategies, and classroom management. And it included questions like, when you're teaching online, can you support a struggling learner? And then it would be not very much, a little bit, somewhat, a lot, always type of thing, like a Likert scale response. And so the results of that initial time point of data, and we did look at public school and private school teachers as well. We did approach some private schools. We wanted to see if there was any difference. Teaching efficacy for online teaching across the board was lower for all teachers than in-person teaching. So they generally felt less efficacious teaching online. And there was no relationship between previous teaching experience online and efficacy, which is interesting. We thought that those who had more experience would feel better about it, but they didn't. And we also tried to control for synchronous instruction time. So did teachers who spent more time teaching online in a synchronous context, like through Google Meet or Zoom, were they more efficacious? No relationship there. So something was happening where teachers kind of thrust into this role and they just didn't feel confident in their abilities. We did find group differences between private school and public school teachers. So private school teachers did feel more efficacious across the board on all 3 of those dimensions. And, we couldn't really quite explain that. We did interview some private school teachers later on, and many of them spoke about the fact that they were more comfortable with the technology. They didn't have weeks or months or years of experience, but they had all had a meeting on Zoom before, or they'd all been using Google Classroom. So they felt more comfortable with some of those digital technologies. So I think that might have influenced their sense of efficacy. We also stipulated that within private schools, because you're not sort of making decisions at a board level, you're making decisions at the school level, it's easier to affect change. So it's easier to say, okay, we're all going to be doing this for our online learning, and then implement that change quickly. Whereas within the public school boards, a lot of the decision making, has to go through layers of approval. It takes a lot more time. So we thought that may have contributed. We found that across the board, teachers felt the least efficacious in their ability to engage their students. We thought it was going to be classroom management, but actually, you know what teachers said about classroom management? They said, it's much easier to manage our students because we can just mute them. So that was something that, of course, is more challenging in an in-person context, right? Anyway, so we decided we were intrigued by our results. We started writing them up, and then we thought, we should, nobody thought the pandemic was going to continue on for so long and be so disruptive to learning and teaching. But it was. So we decided, let's do another round of data collection. Let's invite these teachers back a year later, and let's see if things have changed. So a year later, well, not quite a year later, about 10 months later, we invited the same participants back, and many returned. And we also added a new group of teachers, virtual school teachers. So we thought, let's get virtual school teachers who have been teaching virtually all year, who arguably will have the highest level of efficacy and certainly at least the most experience, right? In terms of hours of synchronous instruction or asynchronous instruction. So at our second point in data collection, we found similar patterns. So we found that, yes, both the public school and private school teachers who came back at time 2, so a year later, their efficacy did improve. Virtual school teachers were higher than public school teachers, but private school teachers were still the highest. So they still maintained the highest sense of efficacy. We saw growth in all groups, well, not virtual schools, because that was the first time we collected data on virtual school teachers. But essentially, how it looked was all teachers feel more confident in person, even a year later. They have more efficacy for teaching in person. And then online, the lowest were the public school teachers, followed by the virtual school teachers, followed by the private school teachers. But we did see growth over the year. So that was interesting. And same trends in terms of student engagement being the lowest of the three subscales. We also conducted some interviews, which were very interesting. Now, these were open-ended interviews, and we did 40 interviews in total, and it was a representative sample of public school and private school teachers from K to 12. And the interviews were meant to tell us more about instructional practices and challenges in relation to teaching online. So they weren't looking at efficacy specifically. It was more kind of getting a little bit more on practices and insights. And that's where we found a number of insights to support the finding that private school teachers had, a higher sense of efficacy for teaching online. They just mentioned having again, more confidence and understanding of the technologies, more structure in terms of how their online teaching was working in the early days of the pandemic. And also many of them reported on having more of a collective sense of efficacy. So, having professional learning communities built into their school structure. So they had, team teachers in the same grades that they had regular meetings with throughout the pandemic. So they were able to collaborate and figure out, a good strategy to teach, for example, a lesson in this. We found some really interesting things in relation to training. So it was all over the map in terms of how many hours teachers got in terms of training for online teaching. Most of the training was self-directed. So it would be, modules that school boards would develop and then, say, here's the link to the module, watch it on your own time. But most teachers talked about really essentially teaching themselves the technology and missing the opportunity to have, guided training opportunities. But what was another interesting finding, excuse me, is that teachers ultimately felt that they were okay with the technology. They had the training they needed to, be competent in the technology, but there was very little pedagogical training. Okay, so there's technical training. This is how you use Zoom. This is what a Google Classroom is. These are various apps you could use for assessment. But then there's pedagogical training. So how do I teach a child to read online? How is that different from teaching that child to read in person? So very little training targeted the pedagogy of teaching online. And so I think many teachers were sort of struggling to try to adapt their in-person curriculum and program for online. And really, the learning needs and assessment needs are different in many cases. So that was an interesting aspect. So we recently published some of our research in Principal Connections, which is a professional magazine that targets school administrators and leaders in education. We really wanted to publish some professional journals and publications because we want teachers and principals to read this research. And when it's in an academic journal, it's really important. You're disseminating, you're sharing to the field of academics. But I don't know a whole lot of teachers who read academic journals in their free time, right? So not to mention access issues anyway. So we published in this magazine, and ultimately, we presented our research, but we said, what we really need is an effective model for professional development. Teachers are eager to deliver high quality online instruction to their students. And there are some ways in which they're lacking efficacy in their abilities to do this. And a structured, job embedded, professional development program that focuses on pedagogical training and trying out the tools and technologies in the context of their own classroom is going to be more meaningful than watching a 10-minute YouTube video on how to set up a Google Classroom. So that's where we are with our research now. We're just we're now going to write up the whole study for publication, including the qualitative research, so a mixed method study. And we're going to be presenting actually on some of the qualitative research at AERA this April in California. And then my hope is that we'll actually continue this research and look at post-secondary teachers' advocacy for teaching online. So look in the university and college context, again, from the perspective of the teachers and instructors, but how do teachers and instructors in the university and college context feel about their ability to deliver a meaningful online curriculum to their students? So that was a long answer. I hope that I answered what you asked.
Thank you so much for that answer. Honestly, like the research that you're looking into and the links that you've mentioned and the differences between public versus private schools and what you're intending on going on to look at with secondary schools, I find them very interesting. And when you actually mentioned the differences between private and public schools, and that I think might actually add into when you do actually discuss the secondary like education as well, post-secondary education, is the fact that perhaps the efficacy of the teachers or their prediction of their own efficacy is also sort of determined by their beliefs of how students will react. And maybe because private school teachers think that students in private schools will have more means to be able to sort of keep up with the online education system, then they have higher efficacy beliefs on themselves. So I think that might be also, if such is the case, then perhaps it would also be reflected in post-secondary education, since probably college students would also have the same ability or higher abilities than kids in public schools. And I think that's very, very interesting to look into. So thank you so much for doing that work. And I'm so excited to read that paper, to be honest, once it's
Sarah,
published.
I'm going to say one more thing, because I think it's important to mention this distinction. When we first found that difference between public schools and private schools, we were a little nervous because we thought, is this suggesting that what's happening in private schools is better than what's happening in public schools? And we really thought long and hard about that. And we believe that is not the case. And I really wanted to reinforce what I think is the most important finding is that in in-person teaching, there was no difference between private school and public school teachers in terms of their teaching efficacy. So something about that transition to online, and as you said, having some knowledge of the technology, having confidence that your students have some understanding of the technology, that may have been more salient in the private school setting, and that may have influenced their higher level of efficacy. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important that we don't try to interpret this and suggest private schools are better at online teaching than public schools, because anecdotally, having observed lots of different contexts of virtual learning now, and as a parent, I haven't observed that. I think that it's certainly not as simple as saying one is better than the other. Anyway, thank you. Just wanted to add that because I do think that's an important
sure.
distinction.
Yeah, it's very important. Thank you for that. So I also wanted to ask you, what are some of the challenges that your own students have faced? So sort of like university age students during COVID-19 pandemic, and how have these challenges impacted the virtual classroom environment? I know you've spoken about the challenges that you've met with trying to incorporate a hybrid of teaching style, but in general, if we're talking about sort of a fully virtual classroom, what is one of the biggest challenges to them sort of absorbing the information that you're stating was?
Okay, so their learning and understanding of the content. I'm more focused on that. Okay, so I mean, I think even though this wasn't your question specifically, I think it's important to mention. I think one of the biggest issues, is related to equity, and this is what we found in the elementary school and in the K to 12 context as well, is that not everybody is in the same situation in terms of their accessibility to high quality, consistent internet, to devices that work effectively, to a quiet workspace where they can focus and engage in the lecture. So, again, we have such a range. We have people who are, home with many other people working from home and, with spotty internet on the best of days. And then we have students who may have, a dedicated office and they have maybe, a hardwired internet line, no issues, right? So there's a huge amount of variability in terms of just access to the course. And I think that that's an important point to mention. So if students are all able to access the course without internet disruptions, I think one of the issues for students is being engaged. It is hard to stare at a screen and listen and stay focused for sometimes 3 hours. I try to be really mindful of that in my teaching. When I'm teaching in person, I do take the full 3 hours. When I'm teaching online, I don't. I usually take about 2 hours and I break that up. I'll lecture for 10 or 15 minutes and I'll stop and we'll do a poll with responses in the chat, or a game, or a word cloud, or a breakout room activity. So I'm really trying to kind of introduce some ideas, elicit discussion, or the opportunity to apply those ideas, and then we'll move back into kind of a lecture for periods of time. So I'm trying to break it down. And as a teacher of children, I would hope that's the same approach that they're taking as well. I think that that's not simply a pedagogical strategy that's appropriate for the youngest of learners. I think that that's important for all students, adults and children alike. So that I find increases engagement of my students. It's just really breaking it up. And then, I don't require my students to have their cameras on, but I do encourage them. And I ask them, if they're not going to have their cameras on, if they could upload a photograph or an avatar, an image to their Zoom profile. So at least we're kind of getting to know them a little bit, even though we can't see their face. I ask the same of my students for their Quarkus profile to upload a photograph or an image, so that if they're posting a discussion board, we can see an image tied to Sarah, for example, instead of just your initials. So I think that's a little bit of community building. I do try to do community building activities in my teaching. So one of the first things I do when I introduce students to a new course is, the week before classes start, I set up an introduce yourself discussion board. And I have students, for example, choose, it depends on the course. So, an example might be, choose an adjective to describe yourself and explain why, you chose that, or choose a photograph that represents your earliest memory of learning. It can be a stock image. It doesn't have to be like a personal photograph. And then they reflect on that. So some kind of icebreaker that will get the students engaged. And I'm very explicit. I'll say, post your comment and then reply to 2 of your peers. So then, it's kind of forcing them to get the dialogue going, but they seem to appreciate that. So, taking steps to build a sense of community in a virtual environment is really important, because then that helps me also to spot students who maybe aren't as engaged, and I can follow up with them privately and sort of say, how can I support you to be more engaged in class? I think just being very explicit about expectations and guidelines surrounding assignments and submissions. And, I think I'm known for my announcements. I always have like 5 or 6 announcement slides at the beginning of each class, but I repeat the same information pretty consistently from week to week, and I post it in Quarkus. So I'm sort of trying to adopt sort of like universal design for learning approaches, multiple representations, multiple opportunities to ask questions and seek additional resources. So students kind of know where to find things in various places. And then in terms of the way I assess students, I try to invite, again, like sort of a UDL approach as well, in terms of giving students choice in how they complete an assignment or a presentation, whether that's choosing the topic or whether it's, and I do an open book midterm test, an online midterm test in one of my classes. And I give students the choice to answer, a certain number of questions from a bank of options. So, I think giving students some autonomy and freedom to make choice is helpful. It helps to keep them engaged, I think. And I also find it helps students to feel like the assessments are fairer and maybe more connected to what they might be expected to do in the field. So yeah, I would say engaging students is the biggest challenge for me as an online teacher. But again, I'm so fortunate because I get my students multiple times during their degree. So I get to know them well, and I can connect with them if they're struggling early enough to do something about it. And so fortunately, I've been able to support students in such a way that I think they get a lot out of the courses in the end. I think that, am I missing anything? Was there anything else? Okay.
No, that was fantastic. It's like, it's so nice to hear. And I'm sure like everybody who will listen and like tune into this will be so appreciative of like a professor like saying all of these things, because I think, as students ourselves, like sometimes we like kind of like, it's nice to know that like our teachers and our professors and our mentors are looking out for us and like are considering, how they can make their like didactic and pedagogical practices more like amenable to the needs of students as things change. And I think especially in Ontario, it's been so all over the place with like varying restrictions and that sort of stuff. So to know that like you're so considerate and that you really take the time to like plan all kinds of different activities. Like personally myself, I get distracted really easily. So I appreciate when professors have little like breaks, even like just 5-minute breaks to kind of like take a step back from the screen, or like doing like a breakout room or like an activity, or just allowing like space to speak. So yeah, as I even just like speaking on behalf of myself, everything that you said is just so refreshing and nice to hear. And so I appreciate all the time that you dedicate to your pedagogy.
No, I really, I think it's important to give students the opportunities that they need to show their greatest potential, while of course, maintaining some sense of objectivity and maintaining standards and such. You can be confident that when students graduate from your program in the university, they will be prepared, right? So, it's not like it's a bit of a balancing act. It's figuring out how to plan for assignments and opportunities that will reach all of your students, but also be rigorous enough that you are, confident that you are preparing these students to be successful in the workplace. And then ensuring that, all of this is equitable, right? So, deadlines is something that often some students struggle with. And, I'm pretty rigid with my deadlines. And what I typically do is I sort of set a deadline. And then, I say, this is when the paper's due. And then I sort of gauge how students are feeling about that. And occasionally we do collectively decide to move a deadline. But that is sort of like a community decision, and it's balancing with my grading expectations and, their personal circumstances. But I would rather move the full deadline for all students 2 or 3 days, a week at max, than, accommodate individual students, unless of course, they have a specific accommodation in which having, a looser, more flexible deadline really will help them in their learning and academic development. But I think that, again, working together to figure out an academic plan that is going to support students, but in an equitable way is really important.
For sure. Okay, so we'll move on to our question number 4. According to an article by Andrew Hargraves in the journal Facets, the 3 core characteristics of teaching and teacher quality include development of teacher expertise, the nature of teaching as an emotional practice in which the well-being of students and teachers is reciprocally interrelated, and the ways in which external changes either enrich or deplete the teacher's professional social capital have had their development hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated public health restrictions. Firstly, do you agree with the 3 core characteristics of teaching and teacher quality as laid out in Hargrave's article? Why or why not? Moreover, do you agree that these characteristics were in fact hampered by the pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm certainly a big supporter of Andy Hargraves. I think his work is really, really meaningful. It's action research. He works with teachers in school context. Like it's all very much situated in a meaningful and authentic context. So I generally agree with everything that Andy Hargraves has to say. I mean, I don't know that I could say with confidence that these kind of 3 core characteristics are exclusive to teaching, and then there's no other considerations. I think that there are many dynamic variables that will influence teaching and practice and learning outcomes, but I definitely think that these characteristics, these are important and valid for sure. So teacher expertise, I think absolutely. We need our teachers to be competent, to have expertise, if you look at the Ontario College of Teachers Standards of Professional Practice, for example, professional learning is one of the, most important standards there. So that is certainly, I think, a common view. Emotional practice. So I do agree that teaching is emotional practice. I mean, I mentioned that earlier already. I think the best teachers have great emotional intelligence and ultimately are empathetic and understanding of their students and take the time to really know their students and how to support their social and emotional needs and learning needs, of course. And that's the teacher-student relationship, but also teacher and colleague and student, like child and child or learner and learner relationships. And I would definitely agree that external changes can enrich or deplete teachers' professional and social capital as well. So I think the pandemic affects all of these things. I think that maybe the one characteristic that has the potential to be less affected by the pandemic might be teacher expertise, in the sense that, I think it has been affected. Let me backtrack. I do think teacher expertise has been affected, but I think that it doesn't have to be so strongly affected. I think there are ways to, for example, adjust the content of teacher education programs, for example, to support teaching online. Hopefully not as a requirement for the long-term future, but in the interim, I think that teacher education programs should be preparing teachers for providing meaningful online instruction. Not as the focus, but if you're in the situation, again, here's some great strategies. And we know there's such a wealth of knowledge available to teachers online. So I think, many of those, many sources of information and opportunities to develop expertise in teaching should be fairly pandemic resistant, or have the potential to be. I do think there have been a lot of disruptions related to teacher training and professional development, particularly in terms of collaborative professional learning. But I think that, I sort of feel like we should know how to prepare our teachers regardless of the context of learning. Emotional practice. I think the pandemic has just been so, has had so much emotional weight and burden for teachers, for everybody, for all living humans on this earth. Can we say with any certainty that there are groups of people who have not been deeply emotionally affected by the pandemic? I'm not sure we can say that. So I think sort of the emotional practice of in terms of students' well-being and teachers' well-being, and the sort of reciprocal nature of this has been absolutely affected, as teachers are again, dealing with the responsibilities of teaching, and simultaneously many are dealing with the responsibilities of having children at home or family members to care for. There's so much fear connected to the pandemic, fear of getting COVID and spreading it, and accessing resources. Simple resources like basic goods, consumer goods. Early in pandemic, having enough toilet paper or fresh water to drink and some can, toilet paper is obviously a luxury in our community compared to others, but even access to food and the basics of living are certainly considerations of some people. So when your basic needs and necessities of life are not being met, and there's so much emotional turmoil in the environment due to just the uncertainties of the layers upon layers of uncertainties related to the pandemic, I think that there's just an emotional burnout that both teachers and students are facing, and I think it's really impacted practice and learning. And ultimately, the conditions in which teachers are teaching, whether through a pandemic or otherwise, can serve to either enrich or deplete professional and social capital and the ability of teachers to really, know their students, understand their students' needs, work collaboratively in a professional way, and can ultimately be hampered. Yeah, I mean, and then, you gave some examples, sort of social distancing, online learning. I mean, just as an example, the sense of community and collaborative learning or collaboration among colleagues, so professional learning communities among teachers, for example. Unless there were online professional learning communities developed, like, teaching became a very solitary profession, online. Because now teachers are teaching online and they have literally no contact, very little contact with their peers, their colleagues. So, that's an example where in many schools, I think that the opportunity to engage in professional and social capital building activities with colleagues was largely taken from teachers for periods of time. Social distancing. I mean, social distancing. I have a kid, so just for some context, I have a grade 1 son and a JK son. So virtual learning is not, my grade 1 son is more autonomous in his learning this year. So he was able to kind of keep things going, mainly needed support for tech. But my little guy, he just could not, he was trying so hard, and the teachers were trying so hard, but a 4-year-old is not meant to learn in a virtual context, right? But then you go into class and, they're not able to really sit at the same tables together on the carpets. They all have their little social distance squares. It's like heartbreaking, right? Kids are meant to learn collaboratively at the age. I mean, school for a kindergartner is, more important in terms of social development and the ability to connect and work in pro-social ways with their peers than likely the academic skills they're learning at that point. And so much of that has been robbed of the students or tampered down in some ways. So I think that there's lots of implications, and I think that it's so hard to plan for, because I think we could be doing things better. And certainly what's happening in classrooms now is much better than it was a year ago, in terms of figuring out how to teach in a meaningful way while having various rules and regulations surrounding social distancing and cohorts and whatnot. But it's so hard to plan because we want to be out of this, right? We want to go back to what we had before. So we're not putting a lot of money and energy into thinking about models of best practice for pandemic classrooms or for virtual learning, because we're hoping that we don't have to be in this context. So we're kind of stuck in this place where it's like, we're just trying to get to the way it was, but we're not giving enough time and energy into focusing on how to make the current context really the most meaningful it can be. And of course, it varies so much by school, by teacher, by board. And please, I don't want anyone to misinterpret what I'm saying. School boards and schools they're doing the best they can. They are trying so hard. They are really working hard to figure out how to provide meaningful instruction to students. And many school boards across the province, all teachers are delivering in a dual delivery modality. So they're teaching some students in person and also trying to accommodate virtual learners. So teachers have been tasked with really impossible responsibilities right now, and they're doing the best they can. But I think, we as a community of researchers and academics and decision makers, leaders, policymakers, really need to come together and try to figure out a model of best practice for the future. Hopefully something we don't need to rely on, but something that, is situated in best practice, is research-based, so that we can go into this. Should we have to do this again for whatever reason? we are better prepared. So yeah, so I guess in my very short answer to that question is I do agree with these characteristics, and I think they were hampered, some more so than other during the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that answer, and thank you for touching upon the idea of how development might be affected of children by the social distanced school class environment, even if it is in person, because I think that's very important to point out. And I also wanted to ask you. So according to data compiled by UNICEF, 31% of school children worldwide, which is 463 million, cannot be reached by the broadcast and internet-based remote learning policies, either due to the lack of necessary technological assists at home, for example, like computers or tablets, or because they were not targeted by the adopted policies in their respective nation, like, for example, not being part of primary or secondary school age. How does this statistic compare with what you found in your own research? And what are the disparities in access to education or the technologies required for education for engaging in class within the populations you're looking at?
Great. So yeah, I mean, UNICEF and the United Nations have done some really great research looking at kind of globally the impact of the pandemic on learning and education. And, you know, again, there's not a context that has not been impacted in a real, you know, in a real meaningful way, meaningful for, in most cases, the worst. My research specifically did not look at, you know, incidences of accessibility. So, and this is kind of an interesting point. So we didn't, none of our quantitative measures asked about, you know, how, about teacher nor students' access to internet or devices, because that wasn't the focal point of our research. In our follow-up interviews, we asked questions of teachers about kind of challenges, but we had no explicit questions about equity or inclusion or accessibility. However, every single teacher participant mentioned accessibility and inclusion in their responses. They just came out so naturally. It was so pervasive for these teachers that this is what the paper we have submitted to and will be presenting at AERA is all about, is this sort of discovery of this digital divide through our research, totally incidentally. And lots of people are certainly publishing about this, and we knew this was a problem. It just, again, wasn't the focus of our research, but it was so pervasive to teachers, it came out anyway. So teachers really did talk about how there were some students in their class that, you know, didn't have, you know, again, consistent internet connections. Most students had a device because there were efforts of schools to deliver devices, but many teachers said, they have devices, but they don't know how to use them. You know, how can I support a child in how to use a device virtually when I'm trying to you know, teach another 20 children online? Like, I'm so limited in my ability to support them. So that was certainly an issue related to equity. Many teachers talked about the fact that, you know, these children came from very supportive and loving homes with parents who tried to support them, but couldn't because they were themselves working a full-time job, or perhaps the language of instruction was not a language that the home environment was fluent in, and so parents or caregivers were not able to support their child in that language of instruction, or didn't have the requisite skills or knowledge to support them, for example. So, you know, we're in a situation where really most of the instruction is whole group instruction, and where the teacher in an in-person setting could kind of incidentally move around the classroom, check in with students and support them while they're engaged in the learning, that opportunity has been taken away. So students are now relying more so on parents or caregivers in the home environment or siblings. But of course, we know there's a huge amount of variability in terms of access to supports at home, you know, even within settings where there is maybe an adult that can sit next to a young child as they're learning, you know, do they have the capacity to essentially learn next to them and help their child? And in many cases, that's not happening. So those were certainly issues related to access and equity and support and engagement. I mean, very sadly, thousands of students just disappeared from the education system, and they haven't all reappeared this year. So these are parents who sort of said, and families said, that we can't support virtual learning for whatever reason. We're going to bow out. And in many cases, those students were not re-enrolled. So, this is a huge problem. There are thousands of students whose needs were simply not met and are not currently being met because of the challenges of virtual learning. So, that's in terms of accessing the learning context specifically. But, in other parts of the world, there are many other social issues related to closures of schools and, what children were then doing during the day. Many of them were forced into working contexts, into child labor. There was lots of challenges, particularly for women and girls, in terms of the school environment being the safest place for these children, and they're now not in the school environment when school was virtual or delivered via another means. So many at-risk communities and populations are further at risk because of school closures. And again, we're seeing many of these disparities in learning in terms of, so it'll be interesting to see the research on learning outcomes. So like, what is the actual impact of the pandemic and these school closures in terms of students' learning outcomes? And that's not something I'm examining, but I'm constantly looking at the research to figure out what has been assessed and measured. But many of these inequities are not new. They've become more transparent. So the disparities in terms of learning opportunities have just become more exacerbated by the pandemic. So these sort of gaps, we sometimes refer to them as sort of gaps in knowledge or opportunity. So those students who are more at risk for having, lower academic outcomes are now even more at risk than they were before. So we're sort of seeing these disparities widen even more so. And we would be ignorant if we thought that a return to in-person school means that these disparities will close, these gaps will close, and everybody's going to be have an equal opportunity for learning and academic outcomes. It's not going to be the case. There's going to be resources are really going to need to be provided to schools and school boards in order to support students who are coming back into learning, having essentially been out of it for so long. So I think that it's the populations that were already at risk for having learning challenges or more negative learning outcomes that now we're seeing these challenges be even more pervasive. And again, I think that a lot more attention and energy is going to need to be given to really meet these students where they are in terms of their learning needs and bring them back to a given standard or benchmark. One of the things we didn't mention, it's in the next question. I was going to say, because nutrition programs is another big one, right? And anyway, I'll wait until the next question because I think that's coming up again.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking about all those various things. You really address kind of every single area. And I think the one thing that really stood out for me, you talked about those who had lower learning or education outcomes prior to the pandemic were automatically disadvantaged again, so much more. My best friend does child and youth at Niagara College. Shout out if you're watching. And she was saying she worked it's a program called RISE. It's in the Niagara region. So it's an education program for students who are experiencing mental health issues, have had behavioral issues at school, or face suspension, expulsion. And she was saying, for the most part, a lot of times, when they were told over the holiday that they were going to be an online school, they told her, she was a student aide, we're not going to be doing it. I can't learn from home. And you also have to in talking with her and having various conversations, you realize home environments are not necessarily the safe place that some people think that they are. It can be a dangerous place. It can be a place that's just not conducive to learning. You may not have access to other things. There's other concerns on your plate that when you're able to actually go to school, that you might be able to either forget about or just get away from, or kind of fulfill some of those needs at school that you might not be able to fulfill at home. Sorry, I realize I'm going on a bit of a tangent there.
No, but you're absolutely right. No, the home environment is not, well, let's just say this. The school is the safest place for many students who are not able to access school. And there's certainly implications of that. One of the things I wanted to mention too is children with an exceptionality. So children with special needs who are in, very specialized programs have been prioritized for in-person learning, which I think is really important. But when all school programs were closed, many of those students who are particularly vulnerable in terms of learning outcomes and disparities of learning really suffered because they were not able to access a meaningful virtual curriculum whatsoever. But it was interesting because in some cases, teachers in their interviews, kind of in discussions of equity, mentioned that in some cases there are students who actually benefited a lot from the differentiated nature of virtual instruction. So, while again, most lessons are targeting a whole group, the ability to go into, for example, Google Classroom and assign a different assignment to every student based on their own learning needs and expectations was something that was much easier for teachers to do online than in person. There were a few teachers who mentioned that their students really struggled from severe social problems in the in-person learning context. And now in a virtual context, those social challenges were alleviated in such ways that they could be more engaged. So it wasn't all horrible for all students, of course. I think that that's, simplifying the situation in such a way that is not simple, but rather seeing the opportunity for enhanced learning. Not to say that, now these groups of people should only learn virtually, but again, is there an approach that we can take moving forward where maybe we can take the assets and the strengths that we encountered from virtual learning, bring that into the in-person learning context? So again, a bit of a hybrid approach. Why can't we have an in-person learning context, but we can utilize Google Classroom for assignment submission? Maybe that is kind of a combination of both that would work to serve and enhance, all students in their learning and development.
For sure. So this is our final question, and you kind of alluded to it in your response. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say on this particular subject. So with the closure of schools and an on and off ceasing of in-person learning around the world, students are not only losing out on precious classroom learning time, but are missing out on the benefits of extracurricular services and activities offered by some academic institutions. For example, many schools around the world offer breakfast or lunch to their students, as proper nutrition is critical to brain development and productivity. According to the 2016 executive summary entitled Advancing Early Childhood Development from Science to Scale by The Lancet, an estimated 250 million children under 5 years of age living in low and middle income countries are at risk of suboptimal development due to poverty and stunting. To address/remedy these associated issues related to COVID-19 closures, what sorts of policy or action do you believe is necessary? And what sorts of projects or ideas would you suggest?
This is great questions. First of all, 250 million children. That's just such a horrifying figure. Anyway, and I'm sure that's a conservative figure, frankly. Well, I think that I know the logistics of rolling out a snack program when school is virtual are challenging, but I think that, and again, I don't want to discount the challenges of our provincial government in making, province-wide decisions on policy in terms of, acting quickly in a pandemic context. And I certainly, I don't envy the people who are having to make those decisions, frankly. But, I would love to see a situation where maybe individual schools have a little bit more autonomy to maybe provide, for example, gift cards for grocery stores in lieu of snacks and nutrition, and to deliver those promptly to communities or families in their community that need them. If the funding was there for snack and now it's not being used, that seems like a somewhat reasonable alternative. Similarly with extracurriculars, I think a lot of really interesting things can happen virtually. So it's, figuring out how to support teachers with creative ideas and innovative ideas who are willing to run a virtual yoga group and figuring out how to do that. A lot of the teachers who I interviewed who taught in more rural areas, they went to their students' homes and they had a driveway visit. it was really important to them to connect with their students, even one time. Sometimes it was dropping off materials or whatnot, but I think building community in that way is really important. Like, even if, and again, this isn't addressing the question specifically, but that could be an opportunity to share and provide resources, give a device, a little tutorial, make a connection, help the families feel like we're in this together, we support you. It's important to us that you're engaged in this process, and how can we work together to figure out a plan. I think that building opportunities to build community are really important. So I think, if we can quickly mobilize resources, and give more autonomy and ownership at the school level to execute things quickly, I think that that's going to yield maybe a more positive outcome for the students in those communities that need it. But I'm talking from Ontario context and largely a Toronto context. Frankly, there are all kinds of challenges that children face globally in terms of again, even with in-person learning, proximity to the school, to the classroom, like home visits may not be possible in every context. But I think that an important starting point is really addressing how critical the school environment is, not just for learning, but for social, emotional, and physical well-being for many students all over the world. And understanding that taking that school environment away from these students is essentially removing many of the necessities of life. And we wouldn't do that, if we thought about it in that way. And I'm not saying, maybe for these students we shouldn't have closed schools, but even thinking about a model, we're saying, okay, maybe the children who are most at risk could safely be in a space in person. We can try to make a modified program for those students who really need it the most. I've been saying throughout the whole pandemic, and again, not to discount the challenges that high school students are facing, because of course they're facing many challenges, but we all want to be back in person. Let's not represent that any other way. But I was sort of thinking at some point, it seems to me like the youngest learners, well, as a whole, the youngest learners do tend to struggle the most with virtual learning because of their lack of autonomy in learning. So I sort of thought, okay, maybe we can figure out a way to bring back K-6 students to in-person learning, and we can use the high schools instead, and send them to different contexts and have socially distanced classrooms because of that. So do so safely. I know there's all kinds of logistical challenges and it would never happen that way, but why can't we think more creatively about how to support the students who are struggling the most with virtual learning, whether that be the youngest learners or those who are most at risk? Because I think that we could have done more. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that we didn't know how long we were doing this. We sort of always imagined this would be a very short-term thing, and then we would move back into the regular, typical in-person context. But of course, this is going on much longer than we ever anticipated. And I think we do really need to understand that, even if and when we go back to a full in-person, consistent learning context, there are going to be many long-term impacts that we have to be aware of in terms of pandemic learning, social, emotional, and otherwise. We have to be aware that there is so much work to do. And I really hope policy makers recognize that it's not simply going to be as simple as, finally we're back to where we were. It's now we need to kind of clean up this giant mess as well.
Thank you so much for that answer and for pointing out so many important things. And I actually do have a follow-up before we conclude. I know we said this is a final question, but I do have a follow-up for that. I was just wondering, to what extent do you believe that such ideas for example, the teacher passing by the houses of her students are restricted to a certain group of people? And how can we make sure that such initiatives that are taken to sort of engage the students are inclusive of students from different backgrounds? For example, different socioeconomic backgrounds, or households that are sort of unstable for whatever reason, or households where there's a single parent who works all the time and stuff like that. So I was just wondering, how could such ideas be more inclusive of different backgrounds?
This is a great question, and this is a huge challenge in teaching. And there really is no one size fits all approach. And I think that that's really important to say. I don't think that there is one solution that would ensure, access and inclusion of every student or every child or every family. And so, of course, the answer is, so don't do it or don't try it. That's not the answer. But I think that the part of the answer is, as a teacher, as an educator, as an administrator, knowing your community really well. If you know your students and their contexts and the needs of their family, and therefore know which students are going to have an easier time accessing virtual curriculum and those which aren't, or those students which rely more on the school environment for a safe learning environment, and those that's not as much of an issue, I think you can be more effective in the ways that you take action. I think as much as possible, relying on community resources is valuable. So again, knowing your students, knowing the communities. So the area of Toronto that I live has a wonderful community resources. That there's a food bank, there's opportunities for tutoring. Even during virtual learning context, the organization was able to offer safe learning spaces where I think they were child and youth workers were able to oversee learning for virtual learning for not the youngest of learners, but autonomous learners. Essentially, they were able to provide kind of like a library type context where students could come out of their home and be in the local community center and access their virtual learning. So I think community supports and resources like that. But again, you as an educator aren't going to know to facilitate that relationship or access that resource unless you know your students and you know what's available to them. So I think that that's a really important part. And it's not easy always getting to know your students and the families and their needs, but I think that, as an educator, I would really strive to get to know the community, and then also really try to adapt my own teaching and program to be as flexible as possible to meet the needs of students in totally different contexts. And then really prioritize getting those sort of necessities of life accessible to the students who need them, whether that's nutrition, whether that's mental health services, physical health services, really prioritizing those aspects and making sure they're accessible to students. And how we do that, of course, is a challenge, and I don't have a simple solution. But I think, funding community outreach organizations that are able to provide this if schools aren't is one important piece.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Professor Forgie. That was such, I love how you said, you're like, it's not really my area of expertise, and you provided those like eloquent answers. So that was really, really awesome. And I think individuals who are like watching this interview later, like not only will be students, like hopefully it's educators as well. So like they know too, like that there are like community like groups out there, community like institutions that they can like refer people to if like schools aren't necessarily in person. So, parents do have a role in, assisting the education of their children, but sometimes like I'm sure as a parent yourself, you weren't expecting to become, a homeschool teacher for your kids in April or in March of 2020. And I know like my cousin has 7 children, and a couple of them have like learning disabilities. So I mean, she's also a teacher herself, but again, she did not expect that she'd be doing elementary education in addition to like substituting for high school students. But I appreciate everything you said. And thank you also for answering that additional question.
Yeah, of course. No, and I think, if I can give a take-home message to students and teachers and university students, children, whoever's listening, this has been the most challenging time of most of our lifetimes, I think, as a whole. And it's hard. It's really hard. And teachers are working really hard. They're doing the best they can. They're feeling like they're not doing the best that they can, but they are. And, students are struggling, many people are struggling. Of course, some are struggling much more than others. But I think it's really important that we be kind and gentle with ourselves. And, and I say this to parents too, focus on meeting the most urgent needs of your children and, providing them with as much support as you can in their learning, or accessing community resources as much as possible to provide support in students' learning if parents and caregivers are unable to. But I think that many of us are setting really high expectations of what we hope to be achieving or what we hope our students to be achieving. And I think that's not helping. And I'm not saying don't have any expectations, but I think we need to recognize that many of us are really operating on a, just getting through the day kind of approach. And that's okay. That's, be gentle with yourself, give yourself credit for what you're able to do, and try to access and rely on supports where you're not able to where they will serve to enhance your life and the life of your children. And for teachers, again, rely on one another as much as you can. Collaborate with your peers, with your colleagues, use social media sites to really kind of, form those professional learning and support communities, because, this is a time where we do have to work together to really ultimately get through.
100%. Thank you so much for that, for everything, of that last little message. It's been such a pleasure speaking with you and learning all about your research and hearing all of your insights. And I'm so excited for all of our viewers to listen to this. And I guess move forward and engage in their own research and own conversations and actions following this.
Super. And Molly and Sarah, you're welcome to include my institutional email address. If anybody who sees the video wants to reach out, has questions or anything like that, I'm certainly welcome to answer anything.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Forgie.
Yeah,
thank you so much, Molly and Sarah.
It was a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good luck to you both.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye now.